Good morning. Welcome to LoveBabz LoveTalk. I'm Babz Rawls-Ivy. And in studio with me today is Dr. Lorenzo Boyd, who is the Assistant Provost for Diversity and Inclusion and the Director of the Center for Advanced Policing. So today is my third installment of a pandemic conversation. We're going to talk about income, equality, and racism, because that's your forte.
That's one of them. Thank you for having me.
That's one of them. There's a whole laundry list, because I know you were on with Paul Bass and you were talking about policing a while back, right? I don't know, right at the beginning of this whole conversation. But I've been talking about pandemic and all the things that are affected by the pandemic, all the things that is rising to the surface, that people claim they didn't know or didn't see or wasn't aware of. And income equality jumps right up there.
Yeah, unfortunately, it did. And it's really funny that at the beginning of the year, there were all these people that we said that we didn't care about and were, meaningless workers and they didn't deserve a living wage. All of a sudden, the pandemic came about, and now these are heroes and these are essential workers, and we thank God for them, and they're great, and let's give them extra money. And as soon as states opened up again, no, dog, you don't get that extra $3 an hour anymore. No, you
go back.
Go back to your subservient lifestyle.
Why do you think people feel the way they do about the folks, what we consider the frontline folks, the folks who keep America really going, who keep the world really going?
I think because these are the invisible people, the folks that we don't really think about. And I was having this conversation with a colleague the other day. Prior to the pandemic, when you walk through the grocery store, how often do you pay attention to the guy stocking the shelves, or the woman that's in charge of, replenishing, or the butcher or whatever? We really didn't think a whole lot about them. Now, when we see them during the pandemic through our masks, we thank them for coming in and thank them for working. But again, unfortunately, within a month or so, a lot of people are gonna relish them back to their invisible status.
Do you think so? I'm hoping, Dr. Boyd, that won't be the case. That people will want to acknowledge them for quite some time, because the pandemic hasn't gone away. Even though we're opening up, there's still protocols in place. The second wave is going to come back around, and so we will find ourselves back in another quarantine situation, I imagine.
Well, I don't know which Connecticut you live in, but where I live, a lot of people aren't wearing masks and a lot of people aren't social distancing. And even with the protests, I stand with the protesters, but it breaks my heart to see the amount of people out there rallying and protesting without masks. And clearly you can't social distance in a protest, but I think a lot of people moved on from the pandemic. And to say, I think and hope things will change. Remember 9/11? We were no longer black or white. We were all American. How long did that last? That lasted one season. And then, right after Christmas, we started talking about racial profiling again. And it's funny how things change.
So, income equality is not a new thing. I mean, it rose to the top because of this pandemic, shined a very bright light on it. But we've always had income equality. I mean, women make less money than men. Black people make less money than anybody. Black women make less money than anybody, above anybody, below everybody.
Yeah, well, it's been happening. And here's the problem. If you think about the way things are structured, particularly at the top, not that I'm pointing an accusatory finger at anybody and any White House. I'm not doing that right now. But what I am saying is, let's use the food analogy. So if I buy a pizza and it has 8 slices, and in my classroom at the university, if I give 2 slices to the class and said, hey, I'm being gracious, I'm giving you 2 slices. And then I've got 30 people fighting over 2 slices while I get to keep the 8 slices. I mean, the 6 slices. And then eventually somebody's going to say, wait a second, the guy that's in charge has way more than us. Maybe he should give us more. What I'm going to do is deflect from this this vertical thought of equality economically, and I'm going to point you to a horizontal argument. And I'm going to say, but those people are getting slices too. They're not even from this country. Or, say to the white people, you're going to let the black people take your stuff? Or I'm going to say to the people that are unemployed, you can't get this because of whatever. So we do this vertical thing where we argue against each other on this plane, fighting for crumbs, and we're forgetting about the people at the top that have the vast majority of the wealth. So this fight continues, and they do it like that. And as much as the people at the top will point to racialized groups and say things like the blacks really like us, and making this racial dynamic, it's reminding us about this horizontal fight. But we still, 3.5 years later, haven't seen the tax returns, so we don't know what's going on with him financially and who's backing him. But as much as he can turn the tide, and as soon as we started looking at him, he says, I need another deflection. I'm going to defund the World Health Organization. Then everybody's up in arms about that, and we're forgetting about the economic stuff that he was talking about before. It's deflection. It's sleight of hand.
Oh, he's a master at that. I know else is a master at this. We seem to, in this country, Dr. Boyd, celebrate captains of industry or wealthy people. We celebrate them. We celebrated Jeff Bezos at Amazon.
Mm-hmm.
People celebrate him, hold him in high regard, and yet Amazon workers are not treated equitable and fairly.
And it's like that for Sam Walton and Walmart as well. In America, we love a success story. It goes all back down to the American dream. For the most part, people all want the same thing. We want to marry one of the beautiful people. We want the nice house. We want the white picket fence. We want the dog. Many people want 2.3 kids. And to get to that stage, we aspire to the people that are great. And we forget about people that are like us. And we hold people in high regard because they are successful, because we aspire to be where they are. And we forget about these successes in our community. And the people that are truly rich are the people that are not the captains of industry, but captains of community. The people that are keeping our communities safe and our communities together and keeping us coherent. Unfortunately, jobs like that don't pay 6 figures typically.
Mm-hmm. So is there some way to combat that? Like, how do we think about our own interest in the face of celebrity, in the face of success stories? How do we shift how do we shift the tides? Because when I say we, Black people, we historically stay at the lowest of the low. I'm hearing all this conversation around the indicators of low unemployment numbers, but for Black people, I mean, it's still astronomically outrageous high.
Well, I think if we focus on race, I think we miss a major indicator, because there's nothing inherent in the DNA of a Black person that makes them less likely to get a job or hold a job. Or there's nothing in our DNA that makes us more susceptible to crime or to addiction. That's not it at all. People can't control where they were born. They can't control the communities that they're from. And we have to talk about level funding. We have to hold local officials accountable. We need to make sure when the city does hotspots for everybody because students are home, we need to make sure New Holtville first gets their stuff. And nothing about East Rock or nothing about West Rock, nothing negative about them, but the areas in need, we should spend more time there. Because, when we talk about crime in communities and things like that, all that's wrapped up together. And I tell people, crime is not the problem. Crime is symptomatic of much larger problems in society. So instead of overfunding the police and giving the police all this extra money to be reactive and fight crime, if we realize that crime is a function of things like poverty, transiency, homelessness, lack of quality education, lack of jobs, people that are food insecure, housing insecure, if we can solve those problems, crime will take care of itself. So instead of putting all this extra money into police, and I was just reading an article, the LAPD budget is $1.8 billion.
Whoa.
$1.8 billion.
That's like a country.
Yeah. So the mayor of Los Angeles, Eric Garcetti, who's the son of Gil Garcetti, who was the DA during the OJ trial and the Rodney King issues, Eric Garcetti moved $250 million from the police budget into community outreach and social services. And I got to tell you, people in the policing community lost their minds. But they're missing the picture. It's not about all the overtime and working all these extra shifts and doing all this reactive stuff. People are paying attention to the smoke and they're ignoring the fire. Mm-hmm. If we can fix the issues that cause these things in the community, then it's a better quality of life for everybody.
So that's what this means about defunding police departments, like not disbanding them, but defunding them, moving resources from particular whatever to more community focused activity.
Right.
I mean, so Dr. Boyd, we have been watching over the years the militarization of police departments. Like it's been a slow walk and then it kind of sped up. And people feel safer when they believe that they have a militarized police department. Like I think it's a psychological game with people. Like I think they really feel like if they believe their police department has all the tools that the bad guys don't have or are equal to the bad guys, that somehow or other that will make for a safer community, a safer city, a safer town.
So I was in New York. We went to see a play on Broadway. And as we were walking past a subway stop, underground subway, we heard what I thought was a bang. So I said, let's step to the side because they're going to be emptying out. And we stood there watching. As a sociologist, I study people and I wanted to see what was going to happen. And it turns out there was a bomb in the subway. So we stood back against the wall and we're watching people run out of the subway, smoke and stuff. And I said, I'll give it about 2 or 3 minutes. I said, let's just wait. Let's watch. Let's not run. Then about 3 or 4 minutes later, NYPD tactical units and SWAT team came in, and they had MP5 submachine guns and long rifles and tactical gear and all sorts of stuff. Then they go flooding into there and they, mean grilling everybody and, looking really evil at everybody. And I kind of chuckled. And folks were like, why is that funny to you? The explosion already happened. The damage already happened. Now they're coming in and they want to mean grill and stare at me like, I did something wrong. Where were you earlier? So in policing, so if God forbid I get robbed, I get beat over the head and robbed at some point, and then the police say, hey, I've got great news. We found the guy that robbed you. Isn't that great news? No, I'm not impressed. You want to impress me? Stop me from getting robbed. Fix the thing that's going to get me hurt. I'm not really concerned while I'm laying there with a big bump on my head like Fred Flintstone and you're telling me, hey, I found the guy that did it. That doesn't help me. That doesn't make the hurt go away. So if we can get the police to be more proactive, and that's what we're doing at the Center for Advanced Policing at the University of New Haven. Notice, we're not the Center for Traditional Policing. We're the Center for Advanced Policing. So we're taking all the knowledge, all the information, all the best practices that we have in these high-end academic journals. We're translating that into training, and we're putting it in digestible ways that people on the street can actually do it. We just wrote a grant the other day, the Center for Advanced Policing, along with the Tao Youth Justice Institute. We wrote a grant for the Capital Region of Connecticut that we're going to train police officers and young people. Many of them are justice-involved young people. So we're training the police how to better communicate and more effectively deal with young people.
Do you
We're
know
trying
Dr.
to,
Danny Cooper over there?
she's my colleague. That's
That's
my
my
homegirl.
soror.
Yes, she co-authored this grant with me.
Oh,
She's
okay.
brilliant,
I
sister.
figured it sounded like I could hear her hands in that.
Oh yes,
That's why I jumped
absolutely.
in to say that. And she's been a guest on my other show, Criminal Justice Insider. She's one of the smartest people I know. Let me tell you.
Absolutely. I am
So,
proud
all
to
right.
call my colleague.
So go on, finish.
So if we can get the police, particularly school resource officers, gang unit officers, community outreach officers, patrol officers, the people that are more likely to deal with young people, if we can get them and the young people to work together, we're building a situation where the police and citizens come together and understand lived experience. I want the police who come from wherever they come into my city and patrol my people. I really want them to understand what's going on. I want them to understand the plight that we go through. I want them to understand the successes that we have. I want them to see the love that we have. I want them to see our passions. I want them to understand who we are. And that's what we're trying to do in the Center for Advanced Policing. We're not trying to build a better cop. We're trying to instill empathy and critical thinking skills and high-end education and understanding of fragile communities into people. And we're trying to build better people and then usher them into the job of policing. So
So
that
is there
paradigm shift is different.
so is there some undoing racism in that? Is there some anti-racism work in that?
Absolutely. The problem with policing, and when I say this, cops always say, I'm not a racist. I'm not talking about you. Slow down, bro. That's not what I'm talking about. But the systemic history of policing is built and based on slave patrols and the vigilante justice of white men with weapons against people of color. 400 years ago is how that started. And as we go through our history, as we go through the Civil War, as we go through the Jim Crow era, as we go through the civil rights struggle, there's always this antithesis between the police and communities of color. And remember, in the civil rights struggle, all people wanted was the right to vote and a little bit of equality. And the police set their dogs on them, and the fire department put hoses on them. And all they wanted was the right to vote and a level of equality. So moving forward, we move into racial profiling and all these other things. So we have a history of negative relationship between the police and communities of color. And that's what we're trying to fix.
Well, people will argue that the policy of stop and frisk was helpful.
Yeah, those people need to sit in on my class because the underlying premise of stop and frisk in New York and then later in Boston, where I was, the premise came under the article, a 1972 article by Wilson and Kelling of Broken Windows. And the tacit premise there is if you fix the small problems in the community, then the big problems will take care of themselves. And under the Bratton and Giuliani administration, and full disclosure, Bill Bratton and I grew up in the same community and went to the same high school 25 years apart. So we're from the same place and we've walked the same steps, but we view policing a little bit differently because when they decided we're going to handle the small things in society and we're going to handle the little problems, that equated to zero tolerance policing. So then they started arresting people for minor infractions, overwhelming the criminal justice system. But more importantly, now you put people in the justice system, and once you become justice involved, even for small things, it's like quicksand. And it's really, really, really hard to dig your way out of that. So if we can be preventative and not put people in the system, I think that's a better way of handling things. So the stop and frisk, it just put more people of color into jails and prisons. And stop and frisk wasn't a citywide mandate. It was a mandate mostly in poor communities because there's a lot of sections in New York that didn't follow that. And let's just be honest, a lot of times there are different rules for different people in the criminal justice system.
Ain't that the truth? So, Dr. Boyd, do you think it's a good idea for police? Do you think it's a good idea for municipalities to try to police their way out of these protests? You understand what I'm saying? Like, I see that some places they put the police in adversarial position with peaceful demonstrators. And in some places, they are stepping back and saying, we're going to keep the protesters safe.
So a lot of people,
where's the middle ground? Is there some middle ground in that?
well, let's talk about it. It depends on what it is. And the problem is that people equate protesters to rioters. And those are two very different people. Because a lot of times you see peaceful protests happening during the day, and for the most part, they're peaceful and they want to be heard. And then when the curfews come, you notice that the protests start to thin out. And you've got this little bit of time where things are really quiet. Then under the cloak of darkness, you got people rioting and breaking windows and yelling and screaming, setting things on fire. If you notice, those are very different people. And in my hometown of Boston, we noticed that over the weekend, more than 50% of the people that were arrested for rioting and looting not only did not have Boston addresses, but many of them didn't even have Massachusetts addresses. So it's a group of different people coming in. So the police sometimes in some communities are having a hard time distinguishing who those people are and that they are very different people. So let's talk about the protests. So I've been on, I can't even tell you how many interviews over the last few weeks, and people will ask, what is it about George Floyd that makes everybody so upset? Who was he that started this? And that kind of hurts my feelings when I hear that.
Mine too. It hurts my feelings too.
If you think this is just about George Floyd, it means you weren't paying attention. Because it's not just about George Floyd. It's not just about Breonna Taylor. It's not just about Ahmaud Arbery. It's not just about Philando Castile. It's not just about Alton Sterling. It's not just about Laquan McDonald. It's not just about Tamir Rice. It's not just about Trayvon Martin. And that's just 5 years. And that's just the major ones. We didn't even talk about Walter Scott or Freddie Gray or Terrence Crutcher. We didn't even talk about any of those yet. And what's happening in the community, people, particularly people of color, are experiencing vicarious trauma. And it's not that it happened to me or happened to somebody that I love, but every time we turn on the TV, every time we open social media, every time we see the news, we're seeing Black pain over and over and over again.
It's like porn. It's like it's Black pain porn.
Yeah,
that's the only way I could describe it.
But Babz, the problem is the Black community is trying to go through this grieving process and, go through the 5 stages of grief. And the first stage is denial. Oh, not again. This isn't happening again. I'm not seeing this. And then we move into the stage of anger. And people are coming up and they're mobilizing and they're protesting. We want to see something different. And then eventually we start to move toward bargaining. Okay, what can we do? How can we make this better? How can we work with the system? And then bang, we see more death. And then we go back again. And we can never go through the grieving process. We never finish grieving. And a lot of times the Black community is perpetually in the stage of anger. And that's what you're seeing. Because in a lot of these communities, let's take Baltimore after Freddie Gray. Now, we know Baltimore has had a bad police department for years and years and years, for generations. I mean, Hollywood knew it because they made 2 TV shows, The Wire, and Homicide: Life on the Street, about how bad policing was. So we know about how bad policing is in general. And people have protested, people have voted, people have written letters, and nothing happened. And then people started rioting. And people in Maryland and the DC area listened a little bit. But no one paid attention until the CBS burned down. That's when the world started watching. That's when the Department of Justice started to watch. So I'm not advocating rioting. I'm not advocating that at all. As a sociologist, it's my job to explain human behavior. And that's a lot of time what happens because people feel like their backs are against the wall. They feel like society is not listening to them. They feel like the government is not paying attention, and they lash out. People get desperate and they lash out. And then let me add this. There was a popular news network that I personally tend not to watch a lot, but they interviewed me, and the woman asked, what role does the Black community have in fixing the relationship with the police? And I paused a little bit and I said, would you ask a battered woman how she could better build the marriage with her battering spouse? Would you do that? The onus is on the government because the power dynamic is different. Because the citizens have virtually no day-to-day, face-to-face power. They have the power of the vote and things like that. But the police have the power. We need to retrain how we do policing. And I don't want any officer thinking I'm talking about you personally. I'm talking about the institution of policing. I've gone through an academy. I've taught in 20 different police academies across the country. I do about 250 hours of police training, pre-COVID. So I'm in these academies. I'm seeing what's being taught. And if you're getting 905 hours of policing and 8 hours of it is community policing, or 8 hours of it is racial dynamics or diversity, you got a whole lot of way to go, and there's a whole lot of understanding that's needed.
So, Dr. Boyd, when you talk about educating or adding education or re-educating potential police officers and existing police officers, does the pandemic give you another thing that you have to add? Because I gather that this is just the beginning of seeing these kinds of infectious diseases play out. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I feel very close to the zombie apocalypse with this whole pandemic thing. I feel very close to that. Like, I feel we're closer to it than we are not closer to it. And to see how ill prepared we were with this, with shortages and run-ons and all these other kinds of things, and panic and people freaking out. Do you look and see what's the best way to sort of train, educate, re-educate policing efforts around these kinds of things? Because the threat is not a criminal with a gun. This is something else.
When you mentioned the zombie apocalypse, because I'm home a lot and I'm not on campus with students and stuff, so I have a lot of alone time to think. And, following that zombie apocalypse thing, I really hope they're the zombies from The Walking Dead and not the zombies from World War Z.
I know, because they're too fast.
Yeah, so I just want to put that out there. And I don't need to be faster than the zombie. I just need to be faster than the person beside me. So
right.
Let me just put that out there. But part of the problem that I see with policing, and let's just be transparent, the police are forced to do a whole lot of things that they shouldn't do. And society uses the policing as a giant social dumpster. Anything that they don't want to deal with, they throw it on the police. And there's a lot of really good men and women in policing trying to do the right thing. But now we're asking them to be mental health people. We're asking them to deal with homeless populations. We're adding to them truancy and transiency. We're adding school stuff. We want them to be youth counselors. And on top of that, you need to be a specialist in epidemiology as well, because now there's this whole disease thing. And remember, in order to be a police officer in this country, you have to have reached 21 years of age and have a GED in most departments. The human brain doesn't finish developing until 25. So this is a 4-year window where they don't know what's going on and hormones are going and they're trying to figure out their feelings and they don't know who is this and who is that. Think about, if you're anything like me at 21, like, how the hell am I still alive? What are the things that I think at 21 when I was an undergrad at UMass? I thought I had the world by the tail at 21. Then I turned 25 and thought, at 21, I was an idiot. I didn't know anything. I still had to remind myself to brush my teeth at 21, I guess. I don't know. I don't even remember 21. But we're asking police to do way too much because they are the front line of the government. My pushback is we need to push back on other city services. We need to push back on mental health. We need to push back on permits. We need to push back on noise abatement. We need to push back on City Hall. And this whole mental health thing, because we can't walk away from that. Because if you remember, those that are old enough to remember, under the Reagan administration, they decided that warehousing people that had mental illness was not good for them because they kept them medicated and they kept them docile and they never got real treatment. And the Reagan administration said it would be better that they got treatment in the community with people that care for them, with people that love them, so they can be in a nurturing environment. So on face value, that's a great idea. Mm-hmm. The problem is the community wasn't ready to have the onslaught of people coming in. And if any of your viewers got family like I got, and you got that uncle that sleeps in the attic that we don't really talk about, so he comes down on Thanksgiving naked, not on medication, his social worker is not available, his doctor's not available. We then call the police. And the police do two things really, really well. They use force and they detain. And if you don't want either of those outcomes, maybe the police are not the right people to call. Maybe we should call somebody else. And it's not fair to say that Uncle Skip, is coming down and he's acting all weird or whatever, and you call the police and you think the police are going to come and talk to him and have a conversation and high five him and convince him to take his medication. If his therapist couldn't do it, why do you think the police could? It is not fair that we drop that in the lap of the police.
So, Dr. Boyd, so do police departments become mental health providers? Like when you hire police officers, do you hire mental health professionals to ride along with or are accessible to that work for the police department? Do you hire? I mean, what do you do? How do you? It sounds like one or two things is going to happen here. That cities and towns will have to take more ownership of these kinds of areas, or the police department was like, listen, we have to staff up. We're gonna have to just staff this up because, too often we're showing up to places where what you just said, two things we do well: detain and force.
Well, again, I'm going to ask the question because I'm thinking you don't live in the same New Haven that I live in. So if we're going to hire all these people, where's the money coming from?
I don't know.
Did you just hear Mayor Elliker say they were cutting budgets? And my man, Tony Reyes, the chief of police, he's down 100 officers. We don't have money to put in all these other people. The city is struggling with the budget that we have. And then with the pandemic, people are out of work, which means people aren't paying taxes, people aren't buying things. So the state is getting less revenue, which means the state then doles out less revenue to the city of New Haven or other cities and towns. So there's less money to work with. So do we get to hire more? No, because we're cutting police budgets as well. Remember that whole defund the police thing?
Mm-hmm.
Again, we're reallocating assets and resources from policing towards other things. So we have to ask the police to do fewer things because we're giving them fewer resources. We can't ask them to do more with less.
But here's the thing, Dr. Boyd, they're going to get that call with somebody's holed up with a mental health issue. Do they not go deal with that? Do they wait? Do they what? Do they wait till Monday and call 211? Like it doesn't matter if they get defunded. The first line of defense is the 911 call.
Well, then we need to think about what that means in general, because we're going to call the police. And the police have an occupational mandate to respond. They call, we respond. And again, what are they going to do? They're going to assess the situation. They're going to try to detain. The person is going to resist. They're going to increase the level of force. It then becomes an arrest. Now the person is justice involved. That's the outcome. There is no other outcome for the most part. At least on a holiday weekend on the night shift when the younger officers are there. It's a little different during the day. Sometimes with seasoned officers, it's a little different. But the police are going to do what the police are doing. So for you to expect the police to come in and pull out their DSM-7 and be able to read through and diagnose some sort of mental health deficiency, that's not realistic for the police. We're going to call. They're going to respond. They're going to do what they do. And our feelings are going to get hurt.
That sounds very dire, Dr. Boyd.
I wish I could spend a lot of time here talking to you, Babz, about unicorns and rainbows. But let's be realistic. And when we talk in my class, I just finished a class at the University of New Haven called Police and Crime Control. And typically we treat the police as one group, and then we focus on whether or not crime control strategies work. I flip the paradigm and I try to figure out, are the police efficient and effective? Because if the police aren't effective at doing what they do, then the best strategies are going to fail. So my job is to figure out what the problems are so we can try to handle these problems before they actually come up. So yeah, my perspective tends to be, let's look at worst case scenario and fix those problems.
So we're in this state of pandemic, which I think we're going to be in for quite some time because there's no cure for this, right?
Mhm.
And I'm sure there are other diseases that are just sitting in the pocket waiting to be unleashed, right? That's that's the conspiracy theorist in me, right? Which I don't believe exists, but I guess it does. Um, so how do you provide education for police officers in these kinds of matters? And what happens when police themselves are sick? What happens to a police force that is affected by a pandemic where officers are sick and have to call out and all this other kind of stuff?
I talk to police chiefs virtually every day from all over the country. And there's not a day that goes by that I don't speak to some sworn person from uniform or whatever. So the one thing I can tell you from talking to people across the country, during the month of March, there is not one police department that I personally am aware of that didn't have people that were either infected or exposed. And once one person gets exposed, most people on their squad is then exposed, and then they all have to self quarantine. So for the month of March, virtually every police department in this country, virtually all of them, were running at minimum staffing. So they said there's just a lot of things we can't do. And Rynell Higgins over at Yale University, when we were talking about policing social distance, he says, we're not going to do that. We're going into a service model of policing. So he got a whole bunch of masks, and his officers were going around the Yale community in downtown New Haven when people weren't social distancing. The officers from Yale were reminding them social distancing is what we're supposed to do. You don't have a mask on. Allow me to give you a mask. That's the service side of policing that a lot of agencies are supposed to do. So kudos to Chief Higgins and Yale PD for doing that. We see that other departments in New York, we see in Central Park officers handing masks to certain people, asking them to social distance. But in other communities, Black and brown communities, we see people being body slammed to the ground and arrested for not social distancing. So
Mm-hmm.
again, it's about how we handle people. We need to do better with our policing.
Mm-hmm. And racist. Racist. So I just read this piece this morning. Well, I started reading this piece yesterday that San Francisco may stop hiring police officers that have misconduct history. And then Florida at the same time said, we'll take them.
Well, a lot of police departments are having a hard time recruiting.
And why? Why? What is at the heart of that, Dr. Boyd? Why
Well,
is why is policing hard to recruit for?
a lot of things. One, we came out of recession, and up until recently, our economy was doing really, really, really well. The 8 years of the Obama administration ushered us into a really good place in our economy. So when people are looking for jobs, there are a lot of jobs I can do and make a lot of money where I don't have to work nights and weekends and I don't have to be out in the weather. So policing is not the job that I want because I can get this other job. We also see more people going to college and getting the white collar job and not blue collar policing jobs. Plus the negative relationship between the police and the community, and realizing that the police are always under scrutiny. Everybody out there has a camera. The police are always being filmed. And even in my classroom, if somebody's going to film me in my classroom, I ask them, give me a heads up if you need to record this lecture. And it's really weird as I'm walking around and there's a camera in my face all the time, and all I'm doing is lecturing. So I can't imagine in an adversarial relationship like policing, every time you turn around, there's a camera in your face. I can see how people wouldn't want that. So that's a job a lot of people just don't want.
So where does that leave us if we do not have a police force to our standard?
Well, that's what we're doing at the University of New Haven. We have a police science concentration in our criminal justice department. And our students have to take things like policing fragile communities or appearance bias in crime. And we try to build levels of empathy. Again, not trying to build a better cop, we're trying to build a better person and usher them in. And the University of New Haven has the biggest and most profound criminal justice and forensics program definitely in the region. Some would argue, in the country, some would argue. So we are trying, and unfortunately, we can't put out thousands of well-meaning woke cops every single year, but we're trying. We're definitely trying. We're reaching people and trying to get them to understand the communities that they want to live in. And again, let me just back up for a second. We talk about policing fragile communities. And the explanation of fragile communities, when I do my police training, I say, how many people have ever gone out to a restaurant? And you yourself, Babz, you've gone to restaurants before, right?
All the time.
Okay, so if you're anything like me, eventually you get that table that's kind of wobbly, right? Have you ever been there?
Uh-huh.
So what do? You get your party to take that table out to the back and you throw it in the dumpster and demand a new table? No, that's not what we do at all. Yeah, what we do is we fold up a menu or get a bunch of napkins and we stick something under that weak leg and we shore it up. We give resource to it. We give support to that fragile table. So if we do a paradigm shift and stop thinking of communities as hotspots or ghettos or bad communities, label, value judgment, bad communities, if we face them for what they are, fragile communities, then the answer is the same. You didn't throw the table away, you added support to that table. So if we can add support to our communities, particularly our fragile communities, because fragile communities are communities, regardless of race or ethnicity, that have citizens that face significant barriers to upward mobility, to economic power, to education. And a lot of these communities are faced with the problems that we have: unemployment, transiency, addiction, low education. If we fix those problems, we don't need the police as much. Then the police can go back to being the service industry that they were designed to be, and they're not going to fall into that enforcement role that's the misnomer for what they currently are.
So we got about a few more minutes left. Is it ever a good idea to? I mean, I know there's rules around this, using actual military force on American citizens.
No. Let me say it a little differently. No, there's no situation where our armed military should be patrolling the streets of our city. Because think about how the military is trained. They're trained to locate an enemy and destroy them. That's not at all what we want. That's why I get a little antsy because of the connection between the police and the military. The over-militarization of policing makes me a little uncomfortable because the scenario is very different. So I am not at all in favor of bringing military in. What I am in favor of is working with community groups and then bringing in the state police. I'm completely fine with that. A lot of communities have mutual aid. So if something is happening in Hamden, then they can call on New Haven, or they can call on other communities. They can call on the state police. They may even bring people down from Hartford. We have enough police in the state that we don't need armed military on our streets.
Wow. This has been good. I've enjoyed this, Dr. Boyd. So thank you all for listening. I'm Babz Rawls-Ivy. This is Dr. Lorenzo Boyd, Assistant Provost for Diversity and Inclusion and the Director of the Center for Advanced Policing at the University of New Haven. This is a rich conversation. I have to have you. I'd like you to come back to talk a little bit more about this because I find this whole subject of policing exciting and interesting. Policing is evolving, yes?
It is absolutely evolving. And we've got some really, really, really progressive chiefs. And you'll notice somewhere circa 2016, 2017, we started to see a lot more Black females becoming chiefs. There are 6 Black female chiefs and 1 sheriff in the state of North Carolina. A young sister, Danielle Outlaw, not even 50 yet. She's now the commissioner for the city of Philadelphia, the 4th largest police department in the nation. We have Gina Hawkins in Fayetteville. We got C.J. Davis in Durham. We've got all these Black chiefs. And then we have the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives. Full disclosure, I'm a life member of NOBLE. And we have these Black command staff and chiefs that are trying to affect change in communities and in policing, because NOBLE is the social conscience of policing. So we're trying to make a change even from the inside. It's a slow process. If you think of policing as a vehicle, it's more like an aircraft carrier. And it takes an awful long time to make that U-turn. But I think we are changing, because we see that in places like Minneapolis, where they outlawed chokeholds, they also did that in Maryland. And in New Jersey, they're doing police reform for the first time in like 2 decades. Well, a lot of communities and a lot of legislators are starting to make change. And then Senator Cory Booker, my dude, he introduced legislation where we want to keep a national database. So police officers that have 18 sustained reports against them, complaints against them, they don't get to continue to be police officers and violate people's rights. And we're actually going to outlaw at the federal level lynching. It's 2020. Really? We're just now doing that? But there's a lot of legislation that's changing. In order for police to change, the legislature has to change it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Dr. Boyd. I appreciate your time today. I hope
I
you
look
do
forward
come
to
back.
talking again. This was fun.
Yes, you have to come back. This was good. I enjoyed this. Thank you for my third being my third guest in this pandemic conversation. So thank you, Harry Droz. We're gonna play us out. Have a good day, doctor.
Thank you very much. You too. Bye.
Wheels keep spinning to the morning light.